recording. Thanks. Hello, good afternoon. For those of you that I haven't met, which I think is most of you, my name is Christopher Torgalson. That's me, they're getting photobombed. I work for a distributed company called Chromatic. Most of my colleagues are based in the US, but there are a few of us scattered around in Europe and Africa. We do a lot of work for companies in sort of publishing and insurance and some of the sort of, occasionally some of the sort of larger corporate kinds of concerns and bigger retail concerns as well. And in that sphere, we bump into a lot of automation of various sorts. Some of it's ours, some of it's belongs to our clients. And this is sort of a collection of anti-patterns of things that I've run into that sometimes us or sometimes somebody else, the clients or their clients, other contractors, have really done. Most of them aren't such things that are so serious as they'll curl your hair, but just about all of them can be pretty bad. So, as I say, that's me. If you want to get me, you can find me at that strange Twitter handle. So, the starting point is sort of that robots are our colleagues now. We work with them. And in an ordinary day, they do all sorts of work for us and with us. So like they build and compile code, and they sort of concatenate code files together. If you're working in a theme, for example, they minify, they lint, they test, and they deploy. And it's good to have robots on your team. They're fast. They're really efficient. They're super, super effective. They have a work ethic that won't quit. I wish I could work as much as a robot, or as effectively as a robot. But there's a problem. So they're also not very smart. Robots don't have they don't have a lot of brain power. They don't have any judgment except what we give them. So there are hard-working but slightly dim colleagues, and that means, coupled with their terrific speed and their sort of amazing work ethic, it means they can make mistakes faster and better than we've ever been able to do before. Right? We can burn everything down as fast as we want to. And so this is obviously a problem. They're not going away. We need them, I would say. They've really revolutionized sort of how we do things and how fast it's enabled us to sort of put things together and deploy them for people. But this is a thing. So there is a solution, and it's us. So we're their mentors, we're their teachers and their colleagues, and we can sort of, try and put them back together when they come apart, or straighten them out when they go astray. And we need to, when we're building them or fixing them, depending on where you come into the process, where we come into the process, we need to hold them to the same standards as we do to our other colleagues. And just because we're running automation, it doesn't mean we can get away with things. We can, like when we're making them, get away with things, or let them, when they're running, get away with things that we wouldn't let our colleagues get away with. So, as I say, the following is just mostly a list of anti-patterns, things that we've run into that usually made us think, oh, we should probably do something about this. And they are my list of automation worst practices. As I said, not all of these are severe problems. I would say all of them are things that should be fixed or addressed. And Some of them, occasionally, some of these things may be necessary or sort of unavoidable. But at the very least, I would say that all of these things are a sign that you should look, if you encounter one of them, that you should look and sort of think about what's going on. So to keep this possibly slightly interesting, and to keep you guys awake, I have 3 t-shirts here, which I'm giving away. I want you to keep score if you're interested in t-shirts. 1 point each for any one of these that you know of that's actually going on in your organization or in your code right now. And we'll go by golf scores. So low scores win. I got 1 small, 1 medium, 1 large. So to move in, the first one is a variant on the DRY principle. So do repeat yourself. This one is common enough that I have to break it down into several steps, but based on some of the things we've seen, you might conclude that it was actually important to duplicate code and duplicate information and duplicate effort. Why, I don't really know, but we've seen instances of this kind of seemingly deliberate or excessive repetition in a few classes of cases. One of them is duplicate lots of configuration. So I ran into this on a project that became, not became, but all I had to do was change a host name, like change the name of, change a domain. And I thought, okay, we'll go and do that. And when I looked around, I found that this was a Drupal project, that there was information about these domains, the same string for the domains, was found in an Ansible inventory file, which was included in the project as part of the deploy script. Also, separately in the Ansible playbooks, in their names. Also, in settings.environment.php files, so like settings. I forget where we were deploying, like linout or something. Also in sites.php, and then also, of course, in the specific sites directory, like so what the sites weren't running under sites default. Sorry about that. So in all of those places, that particular thing is still in the process of being tidied up, but this was quite instructive, because the main reason for it was when it had been written or when it had been created. It was basically the automation was what was driving a lot of this. Is the authors hadn't figured out how to sort of move this information from like one sort of canonical source, like maybe it was the Ansible inventory file, or maybe it was something else, but they hadn't figured out how to just take it from there and build with it and sort of put it in all the places it needed to be when the sites were deployed. So the second thing, the second kind of sort of DRY problem I've run into is to start over every single time. And this is something I've also seen in an Ansible context where and we've done a little bit of this ourselves, and we've chastened ourselves and are trying to stop, but where different scripts, different Ansible playbooks for different but very, very similar projects were basically started from scratch with almost nothing in the way of abstraction, even though they were almost identical to one another, and could have been handled, I would say in general, with one script and just sort of configuration appropriate to the specific project. This is what I call these pretend we've never done this before design pattern. And yeah, there were two sort of basic ways we could have addressed this, and some of our clients that had done similar things could have addressed it. And the one is to treat it like a module, so like a Drupal module, where you have basically a very generic solution to a problem, and you can sort of supply configuration somehow that enables it to sort of do, your individual sort of projects, satisfy your individual project's needs. And then the other method is something like, are any of you using the Drupal Composer, Drupal project? So something like that. So that thing changes. You start with it every time, and then it goes into the repo, and it's no longer sort of a generic solution. It becomes custom to your project, but it gets a huge amount of the work out of the way at the outset. The customization that happens afterwards is generally not huge, at least for us. Did I miss one? Oh, I think I got my slides out of order, but it's okay. I'm going to skip to something that is tangentially related to do repeat yourself. And this is something that makes me shudder every time I encounter it, and that is keeping your deployment code just anywhere but in source control. So where I've run into this the most is in Jenkins, because it's so convenient. I'm not trying to be critical. It's so convenient just to sort of type a script into the box in Jenkins and then point it at the node that you need to sort of work against. Even though Jenkins provides you with tools so you can get it back out into code, or you could author them in code first and then import them into Jenkins. It's not Jenkins' fault. But this is a thing we've seen, and boy, is this ever a headache if something like a host name or a domain name changes, or just some sort of characteristic of the project. If it changes and you have to hunt around Jenkins, okay, we've got a deployment script, we've got cache clearing scripts and cron scripts and all those kind of things. So related with another problem that we run into in the sort of source control world is this one. This is the one that really makes me sort of cringe every time. Oh, maybe you can't see the background. Anyway, the background is a private key. So I've seen quite a lot of Ansible playbooks and general CI scripts that contain passwords. And it makes me sort of crazy. Because there are, it'll be clear shortly enough that Ansible is the sort of tool in this domain that I'm the most sort of familiar with. But Ansible at least has nice sort of tools for dealing with that. I know Chef has tools for sort of dealing with secrets without having them be actually exposed in source control. HashiCorp makes a product called Vault. There are ways around this. If there were nothing else, you could probably work out a way to do it with GPG. Anything so that you don't have to keep the actual secrets actually in the actual source control. But even when you don't do this, even when you don't actually keep them plain text in the code, there is another thing that people often do with passwords that is sort of equally disturbing, and that is using them over again, reusing them. And this is something I ran into a collection of playbooks that belonged to a single client, but they were otherwise unrelated, where they all used the same database credentials for different databases. And just in case you think there might have been some crazy reason why they all needed to access them with the same databases, there weren't. No one was accessing the databases at all except for Drupal. So it was, I guess, copy and paste, start over every single time. Something like that. And I don't know. The passwords ones really get me. It's one of the we would never tolerate this. I think if if it was in a domain other than the automation. Like, if somebody, if one of my colleagues asked me to review a module that was, say, connecting to an external service or something and contained the actual credentials in the code, it would just get sort of flagged, like we aren't going to do this. We'll do something different, but it can't be this. And one of the things that sort of runs through this so far a little bit is there's configuration information of all sorts. So it might be domains, it might be keys or passwords that, for one reason or another, can't live in the source code. It's either impermissible, like this, or it's inconvenient, as with the first example with the domains, where all these sites running on the Drupal code base all had this information about all these other sites that were running on the same code base. So the sort of way around that, which I know at Chromatic for a time anyway, was we sort of resisted doing this, and we see in our clients too some resistance to doing this, was a build process, like sort of a process of transforming what you've got in source control into the thing that's going to be deployed. So something, a step or two more than just going to the remote infrastructure and doing git clone. And so that's where this one comes from. That's where this, what I call fear the build. And it took us a while to realize that we were already doing this with composer-based workflows, for example. So we generally do all new projects in Drupal with that Drupal. I always forget the name. The composer project for. Sorry?
Drupal project.
Drupal project. Thank you. We generally start all new projects with that, and so we don't keep the vendor directory in the repo. We just build it when we're deploying. And having to do that anyway means you've already introduced this sort of step into the deployment where something else needs to happen other than just getting the code, or getting the repository code onto the server. So we've reformed, I would say, and we're doing more of a proper sort of a proper sort of build step with our CI tools, if we're using Jenkins or if we're using Circle CI or Travis or what have you. So another thing that's, again, common to these, my problem with this site with this repeated information in it that was all over the place. I mean, part of the problem was surely that this was unnecessary in the first place, but the main problem was that I had to go and find it. It wasn't written down anywhere that this information happened so many times in the code base, and it wasn't really typical. I got into that code base, and I work in a different time zone for most of my colleagues, so it was 6 hours basically before I could ask anybody, how does this thing work anyway? So I had to go rummaging around through all this code, trying to pull all the threads together so that it would work properly with my one tiny change that I was supposed to be making. So documentation is important. The robots will never read it, but we all have to maintain the robots and know how they work. So there's that. Another thing that is hard to avoid, I know I've certainly done this with a variety of different things, but is to try to shoehorn every task into like a form that can be handled with just one tool. Just to give an example, I didn't actually try this, but I did float it past members of the team, and it was soundly voted down. I suggested, since, at least in the Drupal realm, what we're working on are mainly PHP-based projects, I thought, wouldn't it be good if we could avoid a dependency on NPM for some of the theming tasks and just use a PHP-based task runner like Robo or something like that. As I say, I got outvoted immediately. Nobody who was using those other tools thought that we could sort of easily reproduce what we were doing without it being sort of just a heavier lift than we really thought was necessary, especially since we'd have to start it with just one project and then see how it worked. And then if we liked it, try to sort of continue. But this isn't the only version of this kind of problem. It's quite possible to go in exactly the opposite direction and try and use a different tool for every task. And this can make for some very complicated code base, complicated to understand and complicated to sort of get running locally, as well as being complicated to deploy. I don't have excellent examples for this, but we just occasionally see things piling up, like where there is, for example, a component of something that's running with Ansible and a separate component related to the deployment or sort of instantiation of a thing that's a shell script, and then separate components that is happening in Composer via Robo, and then separate components that are using Node. So these things start to pile up, and you wind up realizing, okay, I've got 4 or 5 different package managers in use on one project. It was even worse before we got totally away from running SAS script with Ruby gems and started using NPM-based tools, because then we'd have sometimes NPM and gem and Composer and maybe pip if we were using Ansible. And it's a headache. And when it's a headache, when it's painful one way or another to sort of get the code up to where you're going to put it, so that leads to this problem, which this is one, we see this a lot in clients, and it happens to us as well from time to time, where there's such like an environment of fear around deploying code to production that they don't want to do it ever. And will only do it sort of when it's absolutely necessary to sort of push out a new feature or to patch a security vulnerability or something. And I mean, we've had some of my colleagues thank God I've never been on this particular project, but some of my colleagues have been like up sort of halfway through the night, sort of shepherding clients through their deployments that have not succeeded, in part because they happen so seldom that there's just so much that could have changed that could go wrong. It can be counterintuitive, but it makes a lot of sense to deploy code very frequently. So that, I mean, one thing that happens is the rough edges get smoothed off as you break it a couple of times. But also, the changes are generally then small, and they're easier to identify if there are if problems create. Like if we break the build, if we do this and break the build or something, and all we've changed is, sort of whatever module we were updating the security patch for today. That gives us a lot more to go on than if we've had every security release, or not even security release, just every release of a module piled up for months. And we're going to push it all out right now because we need the new features in it, and now we have no idea what it was that actually broke it. So there's that. This next one is kind of my, not my favorite, but it's one of the ones that made me start sort of really trying to be critical of our own deployments and our own sort of some of our automated code. And that was, that it was at times necessary to deploy code artistically. And by that I mean that it involved a fair amount of handwork in unexpected places. So the specific thing that I'm talking about was we had really nice sort of Ansible playbooks that would provision infrastructure for us. All that was very nice, would work super well. Nice and reliable. And then we had nice deployment code built into our individual projects that worked also very nicely. It would sort of, merge to master, trigger the build, and it just goes off to production, updates the running site very nicely, very tidily, and very quickly. But that phrase there, the running site, is what's important, because the way we had these things built, it was not possible to do the same thing the first time, and it was not possible to do the same thing if we, for example, had to tear down some infrastructure and redeploy the site onto something new. So the process looked roughly like provision the infrastructure automatically, nice. Then build the site on that newly provisioned infrastructure the way we would have done 10 years ago by cloning it directly and sort of moving files around and, typing the database credentials into a settings file and all of that kind of thing. Which again, we've reformed, but it was annoying, very annoying. So the sort of anti-pattern here is if you need to intervene, it can be a problem. I would go so far as to say that if it's necessary to do things like have server passwords and stuff, and even database passwords in like password managers or something for the whole team to look at, that itself might even be a bad sign. Just because when do they need that? They don't need it to set up a local environment. They shouldn't be setting it up on the remote environments. So if they are, maybe there's something we did wrong, and we can smooth that spot out and have the robots do it instead. Next, this is one of the slides I thought was out of order. So here we go. This one is it's not specific to Ansible, but it's something that I really enjoy about Ansible, and that's this idea of idempotence, which is sort of the property of an operation that the thing that's operated on isn't changed if you repeat the operation. So, like multiplying by 1. If your tools will report on this, if they'll tell you, like, look, something changed every time they get run, and if it's fine-grained enough, you can pick out things that you didn't expect to change. So, I don't have a good example.
I've always wondered how to say that.
What's that?
I've always wondered how to pronounce it.
Well, anybody is welcome to critique my pronunciation. It's not a word you get to say a lot, is it? So, yeah, it's valuable. It's like a kind of low-level testing or reporting that happens every time you deploy code with a tool that will report this kind of thing. It's related. It's a bit like if you find your composer lock file has changed when you don't think you've changed any packages or any versions, and that may be like a signal to look like, okay, what happened here? We didn't expect to need to commit these changes back. So yeah, pay no attention to it. This next one is something that I have to avoid at times because I like brevity in code, but this is, I find this, as the slide suggests, it's especially a thing that happens in shell scripts, but I would say with deployment code, when you're using shell scripts, that then is the time to use the sort of long flags, the expanded flags, and not make the commands as short as possible, just so that in the maintenance phase you can tell what's going on. Like something that has a huge number of parameters, like rsync, is a good tool like this. Like you might have a stack of parameters if you're rsyncing something, and I don't remember what they are. I would really prefer it if everybody would just spell them out. Don't run this, by the way. You'll have to read. Your bash may not cause you to take the system down, but it might. And related to this idea of sort of obscurity and access is. This is one that I find happens quite a bit with CI tools, or it's something that we have to work to avoid with CI tools, like Travis or Circle CI or GitLab or what have you, where you perform operations inside the CI process, like say it's like linting your code, so PHP CS. PHP code sniffer, linting your Drupal sites with it, say the custom modules directory or custom themes. And you can just put the whole command there into your CI tools configuration file. But then when you do that, developers who want to run the same thing, and again, these can be quite long, right? So they've got tons and tons of parameters or paths or file extensions that all have to be configured in the command. But if it's in your CI file, then the developer is going to have to download and run the Circle CI client or the GitLab runner client, when you could place the scripts elsewhere, like just in a script file if you wanted, or in a composer script so that it's just available as composer PHP or CS check or something like that. Then it's available both to the local developer and then also to the CI tools who need it. Another way that, or another, a sort of a related thing is, this tends to happen in my experience. I work for a very small company. Chromatic is about, I think we're 17 people at the moment. This tends to happen more between us and clients than it does internally because we're so small. Not to say that it never happens, but there are times when the information about the deployment and the automation that the developers need to debug something, being, supposedly we're the application experts, right? So we should have a part. We need to play a part in debugging things like deployments when they go wrong, in case it's at the application end. But we found that the separation of teams, especially in a large entity, like a large corporation, sometimes means we just can't get any information in any sort of straightforward or quick way. And that means we're sort of, we have from time to time been stuck trying to help the client debug something when we don't actually have any window at all into what's going on. So where there's just no information at all. And it can also be, it's not just a matter of sort of intra-team communication. It can also be, sorry, it can also be to do with sort of the UI of certain tools, for example. So going back to sort of, say, Jenkins, for example, not everybody on a team necessarily has access to the Jenkins server, but they're deploying code via scripts that are run off the Jenkins server, and they need to get that feedback. And again, it's not Jenkins' fault because we can report out to Slack or things like that, but it's an extra step that we have to remember to actually do. On the other hand, we also run into this where people just turn it all off. and you have to actually, go around and start digging in the logs actually on the server side. And then finally, along the sort of reporting theme, is the other thing, which is to bury the errors, the warnings, so deep that you'll never dig them out at all, and just report every last thing. We taught ourselves this lesson with Slack, actually, by just plugging a frequently running job into a Slack channel, and then we all realized that we'd all muted the channel, so no one was finding out what was going on anyway. And then finally, in the list that I've assembled, and at least, there are no doubt more, but this one I like, which is we don't need tests. We test other things as a matter of course, but I found that our sort of coverage of deployment tools, both with us and with our clients, was sort of spotty. Now I know that some of these other steps that I was recommending, like sort of running these things often and so on, they help with that. And like, again, tools like Ansible, they report out in a kind of low-level testing every time they're run by saying what's been changed, what's been done. But it can be useful to have actual formal tests, of course, to catch the sort of unexpected. I mean, that's what it's about. So that's the end of my list. I'll just leave you with this sort of parting thought. So, as I said at the beginning, robots are our colleagues now. And it's up to us how they work. So, we build this tooling, we maintain this tooling. It's really sort of our job to make sure they don't do this kind of thing. So, it's up to us, so take your pick. And that's all I got. Anybody get a low score on a t-shirt? No? No one kept track?
Maybe a 3 point something.
What size are you?
Too many things to fix it.
Well, in that case, we'll just make the first come, first serve. Small, medium, large. Anybody have any questions or any obvious ones that I missed?
I have a question that I've been thinking for many months now, and with my co-workers in my company, we've taken that step, but I see nobody else taking. Everybody's trying automators, is trying Ansible scripts and so on, things that you can master but might not work everywhere, or you have to install everywhere. And I see nobody using what exists already, plain bash scripts. So we've taken that step, and it's difficult because bash is difficult to script if you want to do strange stuff, but once it's there and it's done, it goes flawlessly and it kind of worked forever. I mean, it can work on a small VM in Bitbucket, or it can work on a Mac or a Linux and so on. And I'm wondering why nobody else goes that way. They go for stranger process.
I'm not going to answer for everybody. I know why we use some of these other tools, and it's mainly the same reason we use modules in Drupal, like community modules, is we don't, the domain we work in for a lot of this automation isn't particularly strange. So we can use solutions like Ansible, which have a relatively minimal sort of requirements on the destination environment to sort of deploy out there. And we get sort of this whole sort of community of development behind it, as a sort of free thing. It's mainly that. For us, it's mainly that. I can imagine, not in detail, but I can imagine sort of requirements that were different enough that it would be, nice to just sort of start it right from the get-go. And especially, I mean, if you're writing it in a reusable way, like, again, something that you can just sort of give configuration information to. That sounds like a fine approach.
We are not at the point that it runs on every project yet. So the functions are there, but we copy paste them and change the variables. They cannot accept parameters yet. But
Right.
we are getting there. And
Yeah.
we are getting better at Bash.
Yeah. Well, that's always valuable. Yeah. Yes?
So, sorry, my voice is... only two questions. The first one, so you referred to bots as your colleagues.
Yes.
So you assume, you start the presentation assuming that.
Mm-hmm.
That's an assumption.
Yep.
Right? Okay.
Absolutely.
The second thing, do you know the term postmortem?
Yes. Yes.
In that, not in production. And if you do the postmortems to actually trigger the change of process when you find this kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Oh, sorry. I think I missed the question contained in
Yeah.
it.
The first question was regarding the assumption of
Yep.
the bot being a colleague,
Yep.
which is kind of, you know,
They seem to become inescapable. That's all I'm trying to get at there.
yeah. The second thing is if you use the concept of postmortems
Oh, yes,
in
yeah.
depth to actually feedback and engage with triggers to action on these processes.
Yes.
Change that.
So I realize I should be repeating the questions. So the question is, do we have a post-mortem process when these kind of things happen or go wrong or get noticed? Is that right? Okay. So we do. I suspect we could be better at it. We tend to drag it out. We tend to do that more often, according, of course, to how serious the problem was that we've sort of found or run into or been presented with. But we definitely have been doing that for some time. But I actually think it's possible it would be better to sort of deploy that idea at like an earlier stage or like in response to sort of less severe sort of condition.
And I know where we're getting, like the new people that come in,
Mm-hmm.
they actually go and do the whole thing that the others already fixed. So in Acquia, what we do is, okay, I'm not going to mention that most of these things we have there. And by the way, no t-shirts. You cannot talk to other people. That's okay. But the thing is, the way we found to actually fix it once and for all is like every newcomer has to read the postmortems.
Oh, now that is a good idea.
Of course.
Yeah.
Because if you don't do that, then the newcomers will do the same mistakes.
Yep.
Right?
No,
So
that's
they learn with the previous mistakes.
yep. I think I'm going to take that back.
And then in the end of the postmortem, we always have like a series of tickets that we spun up from the postmortem
Mm-hmm.
to actually engage.
Yeah. So actual deliverables.
In the next, it's not a thing that probably we'll do this. No, it's in the next sprint to actually
Mhm.
fix.
I like that. That sounds like a great process. Yeah.
I have a question regarding the availability of the deployment tools or the CI tools to all folks who are touching them. Especially in the setup that we set up and designed, we explicitly hid the exact details on how an artifact was shifted over to the server,
Mhm.
plus what kind of steps were necessary to do so. But we gave our developers an API to access this and an interface
Wow.
to deal with that. Because I didn't like to have any one of them run a shell script or run a batch of fabric files or whatever there has been, because those things might change and they might not understand what's happening there. So we took that kind of burden from them and hid it behind an API.
Yeah.
And they don't know the details behind it. For them, it's like magic. They know, okay, I need to select what kind of tag, what kind of commit I want to release in a certain environment, and then the API goes off and does a thing, and after that there's deployment doc. So I don't know if it's really that useful to overload all the people who are somewhat touching the entirety of the infrastructure with all that information, which they probably not require. Same would be for database configurations. I mean, running a Galera cluster might take some time and skill required there, but the thing that the developer really needs is just the database access.
Yep.
He doesn't need to know the specifics what the infrastructure beneath it looks like. So I don't know if it's a good approach there to really give everything out.
No, I think how do I summarize that? I guess the question is, or the comment is that it is in some cases not necessary and not even desirable for developers to have too close an eye on what's actually happening. Is that a decent summary? Yeah. So I think that's quite sensible as well. Mainly what I would like to get at with these hiding comments is what you addressed with the API, so having access to a way of finding out what happened and what I presume what the outputs were.
Yes.
Yeah.
They see that they have
Yeah, that's great.
Of stuff that happened, but they have no way of intervening with that. In case there is a bug with that, they need to file it and raise it with somebody who knows this kind of stuff, and then it will be fixed. But usually they just fire it off. It's a pre-built program basically. They tell it do something, and it does it for it.
Yeah, I quite like the sound of that too, actually. Yes.
How do you encrypt secrets in your version control system?
So we try to minimize it, first of all, by not doing it at all. But when we have them, we generally use Ansible Vault, which, as you guess by its name, it dovetails nicely with Ansible. And then there's a decryption key that we have to supply to the CI tool or something like that, so that it can be decrypted at build time. And as I mentioned, I don't know anything. I don't know Chef at all, but I think it's got the data bags. Does that sound right? Where you can keep encrypted info. And HashiCorp has something they also call Vault, which is a similar kind of function. Again, which I haven't used, so I'm the wrong person to comment about. Anything else? Yeah.
Probably a question regarding, especially regarding Ansible, might be related to Chef and how we structure those recipes there as well. If you have an infrastructure consisting of different things like database configuration, web servers, and so forth, you usually don't tend to put them all into one big bag of repository and version it all together because it might be different depending on the use case. How would you, in the version control thing where you need to manage passwords as well, because they are database passwords and the application needs to know of them and maybe write them in a file on the server. How do you get away without duplicating those passwords in two different locations or specific configurations which are managed in two different repositories, so you don't need to copy them over again and again?
Okay, so the question is, in more sort of complex projects where there may be lots of moving parts and different repositories involved, where each may need access to the same sets of secrets, how do we prevent the duplication there? Is that a
Yes.
decent summary? Okay. So the first thing is we try not to do that in the first place. So I at least have been experimenting with sort of running the from the infrastructure all the way through to the Drupal install out of one sort of process. Now, that is obviously limited to a fairly simple kind of project, a fairly simple kind of environment. It's kind of a question. It's kind of a question of how you're orchestrating it, I guess. in that it. So I'm just sort of going off the top of my head, but imagining something like Jenkins that can maintain a sort of stock of credentials, that could be sort of one way, and then Jenkins is used to sort of orchestrate all the various parts of the project that sort of all have requirements for some of the same pieces of information. I don't know if it's I've never heard of anybody using this in production, but I know that Ansible has modules like connectors for 1Password and LastPass. I have no idea if I think that's a good idea or not. But you look like you were about to ask a follow-up.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a follow-up. Are you deploying infrastructure from your local environment, like your local machine?
Generally not. Generally.
Or do you do it via a CI environment?
Generally the latter, yeah. Oh, sorry, I keep forgetting. The question was, do we normally deploy code from local environments or via a CI tool? And it's generally via a CI tool. Anything more? Yeah.
One, do you have it seems that you are way more experienced than I am in that part, so do you have a CI tool of preference?
We've recently been shifting away from Travis and trying out Circle CI, which seems to have a lot going for it. Myself, I've been experimenting with GitLab, whose CI tools I really like, actually. But you couldn't call me experienced with them. We got another vote for GitLab?
Yeah.
Okay. And another. Okay. GitLab is carrying the day here.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Okay, if there's nothing more, come and get your t-shirts, and thanks for turning out.